I learned something about grief the night my son died. Silence can be louder than any words people dare to say. My name is Helen Carter, and when I turned 71, I believed my life was finally simple. I had a quiet house outside Denver, a garden that bloomed every spring without fail, and enough money in the bank that I no longer worried about the future. My late husband had been careful with our finances, and I had spent years managing what he left behind. By the time I reached 71, my accounts held several $1 million, spread across investments, retirement funds, and the small trust we built together decades ago. But money has a strange way of making people believe you're safe, as if numbers on a statement can protect you from loss. The evening everything changed began like any other birthday in my later years, quiet, modest, and comfortable. My kitchen smelled like vanilla and cinnamon from the cake I baked that afternoon. I had always preferred baking my own cakes. Store-bought ones looked too perfect, too polished. Mine were a little uneven, a little rustic, but they tasted like home. I lit 2 candles instead of 71. That was our family tradition. My son Michael started it years ago, laughing that no one should have to blow out more candles than they could count. Michael was my only child, a tall man with patient eyes and a calm voice that reminded me so much of his father it sometimes startled me. He was 43 that year, married, busy with work, always promising to visit more often than he actually could. Still, he called every Sunday, without fail. That night, though, the call came earlier than expected. I was rinsing a mixing bowl when my phone vibrated on the kitchen counter. I remember the exact sound it made against the granite surface. A soft buzzing, steady and ordinary. Nothing about it warned me that my life was about to split cleanly into 2 halves, the before and the after. When I wiped my hands and looked at the screen, I didn't recognize the number. I almost let it go to voicemail. For a moment, I actually hesitated. I thought it might be one of those automated calls about extended car warranties. I nearly ignored it. But something in me, something quiet and instinctive, made me answer. The voice on the other end was calm, careful, and professional in a way that felt rehearsed. "Mrs. Carter?" he asked. I said yes. "I'm calling regarding your son, Michael Carter." There are certain moments when time doesn't slow down the way people describe. It doesn't stretch. It doesn't fade. Instead, everything becomes painfully sharp. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock above the stove, the faint smell of vanilla still lingering in the air. "There has been an accident," the voice continued gently. I don't remember sitting down, but suddenly I was in the kitchen chair, staring at the 2 candles waiting on the cake. They hadn't been lit yet. The man on the phone kept speaking, explaining things slowly, carefully, as though choosing each word like it was fragile. I heard phrases, not sentences. "Highway. Late evening. Emergency services." I listened quietly. I asked only one question. "Is he okay?" There was a pause, just long enough to answer the question before he spoke. When the call ended, the house became impossibly still. The cake sat on the table, untouched. The frosting had begun to soften under the warm kitchen lights. I stared at it for a long time. My son had promised to visit the following weekend. He said he'd bring his wife, Olivia, and that we'd celebrate my birthday properly. I remember he joked that 71 deserved more than 2 candles. The thought passed through my mind like a faint echo. I didn't cry right away. Grief, I would later learn, doesn't always arrive with tears. Sometimes it arrives as silence, the kind that fills an entire house. I blew out the candles that were never lit and sat there in the dim kitchen, not yet realizing that the call I had just received would not only take my son from me, but would soon reveal a side of my family I had never imagined existed. The days that followed moved in a strange, quiet rhythm, as if the world had decided to keep spinning while my own life had paused somewhere in the middle of that phone call. The morning after, the sun still rose over the Colorado hills behind my house exactly the way it always had. Light filtered through the kitchen window, landing on the same wooden table where the birthday cake still sat, slightly dry now, the frosting losing its shine. I threw it away without tasting it. I remember standing by the trash bin for a moment afterward, staring at the empty plate, wondering how something so ordinary could suddenly feel so heavy. By noon, the house was no longer quiet. Phone calls began arriving from people I had not spoken to in years. Old friends of Michael's, distant relatives, neighbors who had heard the news from someone else. Their voices were soft and careful, each conversation following the same gentle pattern. They told me how sorry they were. They told me Michael had been a good man. I thanked them, one by one, the way people are expected to do. Somewhere in the middle of those calls, Olivia arrived. I heard her car pull into the driveway before I saw her. The engine shut off, and for a few seconds she remained inside the car. I watched through the kitchen window. When she finally stepped out, she walked slowly toward the house, one hand pressed against her forehead, as if trying to steady herself. Olivia had always been a composed woman, elegant in a quiet way. She worked in marketing for a regional company in Denver, always dressed neatly, always speaking with the kind of calm confidence that made people trust her quickly. When I opened the door, she wrapped her arms around me immediately. Her shoulders trembled, and I could feel the weight of her grief pressing into mine. For a long moment we stood there on the porch, neither of us speaking. Eventually we moved inside. The house felt different with another person in it again, but not in the comforting way I had expected. Olivia sat at the kitchen table while I made coffee, though neither of us drank much of it. She kept staring at the empty space where the cake had been the night before. We spoke in fragments, small pieces of conversation that never quite formed complete thoughts. She told me the police had contacted her earlier that morning. She said there would be paperwork, arrangements, and several things to organize over the next few days. Her voice remained steady, almost practiced, the way someone sounds when they have already repeated the same information many times. Later that afternoon, we drove together to meet with the funeral director. The building was quiet and warm, the kind of place designed to make difficult moments feel less sharp. A man in a dark suit greeted us with a sympathetic expression and guided us into a small office with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. I remember noticing the ticking of a small clock on the wall behind his desk. It was the only sound in the room whenever no one was speaking. Olivia handled most of the conversation. She asked questions about dates, arrangements, and documents that would need signatures. I sat beside her, listening, occasionally nodding when someone looked in my direction. The director explained everything carefully, outlining the schedule for the service and the process that families usually followed. It felt strange hearing my son's life summarized in logistical steps and appointment times. When the meeting ended, Olivia stepped outside to take a phone call. I remained inside for a moment longer, gathering my coat. Through the window, I could see her standing in the parking lot, speaking quietly into her phone. At first I assumed she was calling a close friend or perhaps someone from her office. But then she said something that made me pause. "Yes," she said calmly, turning slightly away from the building. "We will need to review Michael's account soon." The sentence was simple, almost casual, but something about it settled strangely in my mind. Not alarming. Not yet. Just unusual. At the time I told myself it was practical thinking. When someone dies unexpectedly, there are always financial matters to address. Still, as we drove back toward my house that evening, I could not shake the faint feeling that something had shifted beneath the surface of everything I thought I understood about my family. It was a small feeling. Quiet. Easy to ignore. But sometimes the smallest doubts are the ones that grow the fastest once they find a place to live. The day of the service arrived under a pale Colorado sky that seemed unusually quiet, as if even the wind had decided to step back and allow the moment to pass undisturbed. I woke early that morning, long before the alarm clock beside my bed had a chance to ring. For several minutes I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember what it felt like to wake up without the heavy knowledge waiting at the edge of consciousness. But the memory did not return. Grief had settled into the house like a permanent guest, quiet but impossible to ignore. When I finally walked into the kitchen, Olivia was already there. She stood by the coffee maker, her dark coat draped neatly over the back of a chair. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, warm and comforting in a way that almost felt misplaced. She greeted me with a soft good morning and handed me a mug before I even asked. For a moment we stood side by side at the counter, sipping slowly, neither of us speaking very much. Outside, the early sunlight stretched across the yard, touching the empty driveway where Michael used to park his truck whenever he visited. I caught myself looking at that space longer than I intended. Eventually Olivia checked her watch and reminded me that we should leave soon. The service was scheduled for 10 o'clock at a small chapel 20 minutes away. The drive there felt longer than usual. Traffic moved quietly through the suburban streets, and the radio remained off the entire time. Olivia kept both hands on the steering wheel, her posture straight, her eyes focused carefully on the road ahead. I watched the familiar landmarks pass by through the window, small pieces of a world that seemed strangely unchanged. When we arrived, the parking lot was already filling with cars. Friends, coworkers, neighbors. People who had known Michael from different parts of his life were gathering quietly near the entrance. Many of them approached us as we stepped out of the car. They spoke gently, offering kind words and brief embraces. Each face carried the same mixture of sympathy and disbelief that I had already begun to recognize. Inside the chapel, the air was cool and softly lit. A simple arrangement of white flowers stood near the front of the room, and several rows of wooden chairs faced the small podium where the service would begin. I sat in the front row beside Olivia, while people slowly filled the space behind us. A photograph of Michael rested on a small stand near the flowers. It was one I had taken years earlier during a family barbecue in the backyard. In the picture he was laughing, his head tilted slightly back, sunlight bright across his face. I found myself staring at that photograph for a long time. The service itself passed in a quiet blur of voices and memories. Michael's colleagues spoke about his dedication at work. An old college friend shared a story about a road trip they had taken years ago across the western states. Each speaker added another piece to the picture of the life my son had lived. I listened carefully, absorbing every word as if they were small treasures that might someday fade if I did not hold on tightly enough. Olivia remained composed beside me the entire time. She nodded politely when people addressed her and offered brief smiles whenever someone spoke kindly about Michael. From the outside, she appeared strong, almost steady. But I noticed small things that others might not have seen. The way her fingers occasionally tightened around the edge of the program booklet. The way she glanced toward the exit door every few minutes, as if she were keeping track of time. After the final speaker finished, the room slowly emptied into the reception hall next door. People gathered in small groups, sharing quiet conversations over coffee and simple refreshments. I moved from one conversation to another, thanking everyone for coming. Olivia stood a short distance away near a table, speaking with a man in a gray suit I did not recognize. At first I assumed he was one of Michael's coworkers. But as I watched them for a moment longer, something about their conversation felt different. They spoke in low voices, leaning slightly closer together than the others in the room. The man eventually handed Olivia a small folder, thin and professional looking, the kind lawyers often carry to meetings. She accepted it quickly and slipped it into her purse before turning back toward the crowd with the same calm expression she had worn all morning. When she noticed me watching, she smiled gently and walked over, asking if I needed anything. I told her no. I told her I was fine. And in that moment, I truly believed that everything unfolding around me was simply part of the complicated, practical world that follows a loss. I had not yet realized that some of those quiet conversations were already beginning to shape the future of everything my husband and I had spent decades building. After the service ended, the house felt larger than it ever had before. Rooms that once held ordinary sounds now seemed to echo with a strange emptiness that settled into the walls and the furniture. For the first few days, Olivia remained with me. She said it made sense for us to stay together for a while, at least until everything surrounding Michael's affairs had been organized. At the time, I appreciated the company. Grief can make even the quietest house feel overwhelming, and having another person moving through the same spaces brought a small sense of stability. In the mornings, we sat at the kitchen table with coffee while the sun rose over the hills behind the property. Neither of us spoke much. Olivia spent long stretches of time looking through her phone or reviewing documents spread neatly across the table. I assumed they were the many forms that follow a death. Insurance papers, employment records, and the various notices that arrive from banks and companies once accounts begin to close. On the third morning after the service, she mentioned something that caught my attention. She said she would need to visit the bank later that afternoon to discuss several financial matters connected to Michael. The way she said it was calm and direct, the same composed tone she used whenever she talked about work. I nodded politely, though something about the sentence lingered in my thoughts. Michael had always handled most of his own finances. When he was younger, he sometimes asked my advice about investments, but over the years he had built his own system. He rarely needed help. Still, I told myself it was normal for a spouse to review accounts after a loss. That afternoon, Olivia left the house shortly after lunch. I watched her car disappear down the long gravel driveway before returning to the quiet routine of the day. I walked through the garden, trimming a few branches and watering the roses that lined the back fence. The familiar tasks helped steady my mind, at least for a while. When Olivia returned later in the evening, she carried the same small folder I had seen at the reception hall after the service. She placed it carefully on the kitchen counter before removing her coat. For a moment, I noticed the way her eyes moved quickly across the room, as if checking that everything remained exactly where she had left it. Then her expression softened again, and she asked if I had eaten dinner yet. Over the next several days, the folder appeared often. Sometimes it rested beside her coffee cup in the morning. Other times it traveled with her into the living room while she worked quietly on her laptop. I did not ask about it at first. Grief has a way of making questions feel unnecessary, even intrusive. But small details began to gather in my mind the way clouds gather slowly before a storm. Olivia started making more phone calls during the afternoons, usually stepping outside onto the back porch while she spoke. Through the window, I could occasionally hear pieces of conversation drift inside. Words like account access, documentation, and authorization repeated themselves more than once. One evening, while clearing the dinner plates, I finally asked whether everything at the bank had gone smoothly. Olivia smiled in a reassuring way and told me there were simply several accounts that needed to be reviewed now that Michael was gone. She explained that most of them were connected to his work and retirement planning. Her explanation sounded reasonable, and yet the careful way she chose each word made me pause. Later that night, after Olivia had gone to bed, I remained at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold in my hands. The folder sat quietly on the counter across the room. I had no intention of opening it. Not then. But for the first time since that phone call had changed everything, a thought entered my mind that refused to leave. Michael had trusted Olivia completely. Of that I had never doubted. The question that slowly began forming in the silence of the kitchen was not about my son. It was about how much of that trust had extended beyond him and into the parts of our family's life that I had always believed were secure. The next morning began quietly, the same way the previous days had begun since the service. Sunlight slipped through the kitchen window and stretched across the wooden floor while the coffee machine hummed softly on the counter. I woke earlier than Olivia, as I usually did. Years of routine had trained my body to rise with the daylight, long before most people in the house would normally stir. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the pale morning light settle over the backyard. The garden looked peaceful. The roses moved slightly in the breeze, and for a moment the world outside the window seemed untouched by the weight that had settled inside the house. After a while, Olivia entered the kitchen. She looked tired, though she greeted me with the same calm smile she had worn for days. She poured her own coffee and sat across from me, opening her laptop almost immediately. The small folder rested beside her again. I had begun to notice that it rarely left her side. We spoke only briefly that morning. Olivia mentioned that she might need to visit the bank again later in the day. There were still details, she explained, that required clarification. I nodded politely, though something about the repetition of these visits had begun to settle uneasily in my thoughts. After breakfast, she gathered her things and left for the bank just as she had the afternoon before. Once her car disappeared down the gravel driveway, the house returned to its familiar silence. I spent the late morning sorting through a few drawers in the study, organizing old photographs and letters that had belonged to my husband. It was slow work, but it helped pass the time. Around noon, I realized I needed to check something in my own financial records. For years, I had kept a simple system for tracking my accounts. Most of my investments were handled through one regional bank in Denver, and I usually reviewed the statements every few weeks just to remain aware of how things were performing. I opened my laptop at the desk and signed into the account the way I always did. The screen loaded slowly before displaying the familiar list of balances and transactions. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The numbers appeared exactly where I expected them to be. But when I clicked into the activity history for one of the larger investment accounts, I noticed a request that had been submitted only 2 days earlier. It was labeled as an inquiry for authorization access. I read the line twice to make certain I understood it correctly. The request had not yet been approved, but it had been recorded in the system. Someone had attempted to add an additional individual to the account for management purposes. I felt a small tightening in my chest as I moved the cursor over the details. The name attached to the request was Olivia Carter. For several seconds, I simply stared at the screen, waiting for the explanation to appear on its own. Perhaps it was a mistake. Perhaps the bank had automatically linked certain family accounts together after Michael's passing. There could have been a simple administrative reason behind it. Still, I closed the laptop slowly and sat back in the chair, thinking carefully through what I had seen. Olivia had never been connected to my personal accounts before. Michael himself had never asked for that level of access either. Our finances had always remained separate, not out of distrust, but out of habit. When Olivia returned later that afternoon, she placed her purse on the kitchen counter the same way she always did. Her expression was calm, almost relaxed, as she greeted me and asked how my day had been. I answered politely, mentioning the time I had spent organizing old photographs in the study. She nodded and began preparing a small dinner for both of us. For a while we moved quietly through the kitchen, each focused on small tasks. The sound of dishes and running water filled the room. I watched her carefully without making it obvious. Eventually, she opened the small folder again and removed several papers, scanning them quickly before placing them back inside. It was a simple moment, ordinary in appearance. Yet the image of that authorization request remained fixed in my mind. I realized then that the quiet doubts forming over the past few days were beginning to take shape into something clearer. I did not say anything to Olivia that evening. Instead, I finished dinner, washed the dishes, and returned to the study once the house had grown quiet again. Some answers, I understood now, would not appear through polite conversation. They would have to be found slowly, piece by piece, in places people often assume no one will think to look. I did not sleep much that night. The house had grown quiet again after Olivia went to bed, but my mind continued moving through the same questions again and again. I sat in the study with a small lamp glowing beside the desk, the rest of the room covered in shadow. In front of me were the same documents I had reviewed many times over the years, account summaries, investment reports, and the careful records my husband and I had maintained since the early days of our marriage. We had built our finances slowly, one step at a time. My husband used to say that security was not about how much money you had, but about how carefully you protected it. I remembered those words clearly as I reviewed the records again. The authorization request I had seen earlier that afternoon remained fresh in my mind. Olivia Carter had attempted to gain access to one of my investment accounts. The request had not been approved, but the fact that it existed at all told me something important. It told me that somewhere, someone believed they had a reason to try. The next morning I woke even earlier than usual. The sky outside the bedroom window was still dark when I dressed and walked quietly into the kitchen. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, thinking through what I needed to do next. Confronting Olivia directly would accomplish very little. If there was a misunderstanding, a conversation would solve it. But if there was something else happening, a warning would only give her time to hide it. By the time Olivia entered the kitchen, I had already decided how I would move forward. She looked slightly surprised to see me awake so early, but she smiled and greeted me politely before preparing her coffee. The routine between us continued as if nothing had changed. She spoke briefly about a few errands she needed to run later that morning. One of them, she mentioned casually, involved another stop at the bank. I listened without reacting. After she left the house, I waited about 30 minutes before retrieving my coat and keys. The drive into town took about 20 minutes along the same highway I had traveled countless times over the years. The bank branch sat near the center of a small shopping plaza, quiet at that hour of the morning. Inside, the lobby was calm and nearly empty. A young teller greeted me with a friendly smile and asked how she could help. I explained that I needed to speak with someone about a recent authorization request connected to one of my accounts. Within a few minutes, she guided me into a small office where a senior account manager joined us. He introduced himself politely and asked how he could assist. I described the request I had seen in my online records and asked whether he could confirm the details. The manager typed for a moment on his computer, before nodding slowly. He explained that a request had indeed been submitted 2 days earlier asking for management access to the investment account. According to the system, the request had been initiated by someone claiming to act on behalf of a family member connected to the account. When I asked him who that person was, he glanced once more at the screen before answering carefully. The name listed in the request was Olivia Carter. For a moment the room felt very still. The manager quickly added that the request had not been approved and that no changes had been made to the account. Bank policy required the primary account holder to authorize any access personally, which meant nothing could move forward without my direct permission. I thanked him calmly and asked him to place a formal restriction on the account preventing any future authorization requests without an in-person confirmation from me. He agreed immediately and assured me that the note would appear in the system by the end of the day. When I stepped back outside into the cool morning air, the sun had just begun rising above the buildings across the street. I stood there for a moment beside my car, looking out over the quiet parking lot. The evidence was still small. One request, one name. But it was enough to confirm that the uneasy feeling growing inside me was not imagination. Something had begun moving quietly behind the scenes of my family's life. And now that I had seen the first piece of it clearly, I understood that I would need to pay very close attention to everything that followed. When I returned home that morning, the house looked exactly the same as it had when I left. The gravel driveway was empty except for my car, and the garden moved gently in the same quiet breeze that had followed me into town. Nothing about the place suggested that anything unusual had happened. Yet the calm appearance of everything around me now felt slightly different, as if I had stepped back into a room where a conversation had paused just before I entered. I walked inside and placed my keys on the kitchen counter, listening to the familiar silence of the house. Olivia had not returned yet. For a few minutes I simply stood there, letting my mind settle after the conversation at the bank. The confirmation I had received was simple, but it carried weight. Olivia had attempted to gain access to my account. The request had not been approved, but the intention behind it could not be ignored. I reminded myself not to move too quickly. Accusations spoken too early can close doors that might otherwise reveal the truth. Instead, I decided that patience would serve me better. I prepared a small lunch and sat at the kitchen table, reviewing the events of the past week carefully in my mind. Certain moments now stood out more clearly than they had before. The quiet phone calls on the back porch. The small folder she carried everywhere. The conversations about bank visits that always sounded casual but happened almost daily. Each detail by itself might have meant nothing. Together, however, they began forming a pattern that was difficult to overlook. Olivia returned shortly after 2 in the afternoon. Her car rolled slowly down the gravel driveway before stopping near the front steps. I watched through the kitchen window as she stepped out, adjusting the strap of her purse on her shoulder. When she entered the house, she greeted me with the same calm smile she had used all week. She asked how my morning had been and whether I needed anything from the grocery store later. I answered politely, keeping my voice steady. If she noticed anything unusual in my expression, she did not show it. We spent the rest of the afternoon moving quietly through the house. Olivia worked on her laptop in the living room while I sorted through a few old documents in the study. Occasionally, she stepped outside to make another phone call. I did not attempt to listen closely this time, but the same careful tone drifted faintly through the open window. Words about paperwork and account access surfaced once again before fading into the wind. That evening, we shared a simple dinner at the kitchen table. Olivia spoke about small, ordinary things. She mentioned that a colleague from her office had offered to help review some of Michael's financial files. She said it might make the process of closing accounts easier in the coming weeks. I nodded thoughtfully while she spoke, though the explanation sounded less convincing now that I understood more about what had already taken place. After dinner, she returned to the living room with her laptop and the small folder. I remained in the kitchen, washing the dishes slowly while thinking through the next steps I needed to take. Protecting my accounts at the bank had been the first move. The next step would require more careful preparation. My husband and I had always kept a close relationship with the attorney who helped us structure our estate many years earlier. His office was located only a few miles from the bank I had visited that morning. As I dried the final plate and placed it in the cabinet, I realized that another quiet appointment would need to happen soon. If someone believed they could slowly step into the financial structure my husband and I had spent decades building, then I would need to make certain every part of that structure remained firmly in my control. Later that night, after Olivia had gone to bed, I walked into the study and opened the drawer where my legal documents were stored. The folders inside were organized carefully, just as my husband had always insisted they should be. I ran my hand across the top of the stack for a moment before selecting the file that contained our estate records. The paper felt smooth and familiar beneath my fingers. In that quiet moment, I understood something clearly for the first time since Michael's passing. Grief had taken my son from me, but it had not taken my ability to see what was happening around me. And now that I had begun to see the outlines of the situation more clearly, I intended to make sure that no one would quietly rewrite the future my husband and I had worked so hard to secure. The following morning I drove into town again, though this time I did not tell Olivia where I was going. When she asked about my plans over breakfast, I simply said I needed to run a few errands. She nodded without much curiosity and returned to the quiet routine of reviewing the papers inside her small folder. I finished my coffee slowly, watching the calm confidence in the way she organized those documents, as if every step she was taking belonged to a plan that had already been carefully designed. Once she left the house for her own appointment later that morning, I gathered my coat and drove toward the office of the attorney who had handled my family's legal affairs for more than 20 years. His name was Robert Henderson, a patient man with silver hair and a habit of listening carefully before offering advice. My husband had trusted him completely, and over the years that trust had extended naturally to me. His office stood in a small brick building just a few streets away from the courthouse square. When I entered the reception area, the quiet atmosphere felt familiar and reassuring. The receptionist recognized me immediately and greeted me warmly before asking if I had an appointment. I explained that I hoped Mr. Henderson might have a few minutes available for an urgent matter. Within a short time, I was sitting across from him in his office, the same room where my husband and I had once spent an entire afternoon discussing our estate plans long before retirement had even been on the horizon. Robert listened carefully as I explained everything that had happened during the past week. I told him about the authorization request at the bank, about the repeated visits Olivia had been making, and about the quiet phone calls that seemed to circle around financial questions rather than grief. I spoke calmly, focusing only on the facts. When I finished, Robert leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together while thinking through what he had heard. He did not appear surprised. In fact, his expression suggested that he had encountered situations like this before. He explained that moments of loss often bring complicated financial questions into the open, especially when multiple family members believe they might have a claim to something. But he also made one thing very clear. Every account, every investment, and every legal structure connected to my personal assets remained entirely under my control unless I chose to change it. He asked if I would like to review the current estate documents we had prepared years earlier. When he placed the file on the desk in front of me, the pages looked exactly the way I remembered them. My husband and I had arranged everything carefully, believing that when the time came our son would eventually inherit what remained after both of us were gone. The plan had been simple then. Life, however, had changed that plan in ways neither of us could have predicted. Robert asked whether I wished to make adjustments now that circumstances were different. I considered the question quietly for a moment. The decision forming in my mind was not based on anger. It was based on clarity. I told him that I wanted to strengthen every protection surrounding my accounts and property immediately. Any request for financial access would require my personal approval in writing and in person. In addition, I wanted the structure of my estate reviewed so that no outside assumption could quietly reshape it without my knowledge. Robert nodded and began preparing several documents that would reinforce those protections. The process took nearly an hour, and when it was finished he placed the updated papers into a secure folder for me to take home. As I stepped back outside into the afternoon sunlight, I felt a calm certainty that had not been present earlier in the week. Nothing dramatic had happened. No accusations had been spoken, yet something important had shifted quietly into place. For the first time since the doubts began forming, I knew that the foundation beneath my life remained exactly where it belonged. And now that I had secured it properly, I could return home and observe everything else with far clearer eyes. That evening when I returned home, the house felt calm in the same quiet way it always had, yet something inside me had shifted. I carried the folder from Robert Henderson's office into the study and placed it gently in the same drawer where my husband and I had kept our most important papers for decades. The act itself was simple, but the meaning behind it carried a quiet strength. I knew that every account, every property document, and every part of the estate we had built was now protected with clear legal boundaries that no misunderstanding could quietly move around. When Olivia arrived home later that evening, she greeted me the same way she always did, with a polite smile and a warm tone that anyone listening might have mistaken for genuine ease. She asked if I had enjoyed my errands in town. I answered calmly that everything had gone smoothly. During dinner, she spoke again about paperwork and mentioned that she planned to visit the bank later in the week to ask a few questions about Michael's old accounts. Her voice carried the same casual confidence I had noticed before, as if she expected those questions would eventually open certain doors for her. I listened carefully, but did not interrupt. There are moments in life when silence becomes the clearest way to observe the truth unfolding around you. Over the next several days, the pattern continued. Olivia made 2 more trips into town, each time returning with the same small folder and the same thoughtful expression. I noticed that her questions around the house slowly shifted as well. She asked about the age of the property, about the value of the land, about whether my husband and I had ever discussed selling the house before he passed away. Each question sounded harmless on the surface, but taken together they revealed a deeper curiosity about the structure of everything that remained in my name. What she did not realize was that the quiet meeting with Robert Henderson had already closed the path she believed she was approaching. One afternoon, nearly a week after my visit to the attorney, Olivia sat across from me at the kitchen table and spoke with unusual confidence. She explained that she had been trying to organize Michael's unfinished financial matters and believed it might be helpful if she had access to certain accounts connected to the family estate. She said the arrangement would make things easier for both of us. I folded my hands gently on the table and listened to her explanation without interrupting. When she finished speaking, I answered with the same calm tone I had used throughout the week. I told her that I had already reviewed every account with my bank and my attorney, and that all financial decisions would remain entirely under my control moving forward. The change in her expression happened slowly but clearly. The confidence in her voice faded for a moment as she realized that the structure she believed she was approaching had already been firmly secured. I did not raise my voice, and I did not accuse her of anything. Instead, I simply explained that my husband and I had spent a lifetime building stability, and that protecting that stability was my responsibility now. After that conversation, the house grew quiet again. Olivia spoke less about financial matters and eventually focused her attention on her own work and plans. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm, but the balance of understanding had shifted completely. As I sat on the back porch one evening watching the sunset settle across the fields beyond the property line, I thought about the long journey that had brought me to this moment. At 71 years old, I had faced grief that no parent ever expects to carry, yet I had also rediscovered something important about strength and clarity. Wealth itself had never been the center of my life. What mattered was the independence and dignity that came from protecting what my family had built with patience and discipline. And as the quiet evening breeze moved across the porch, I understood that the future ahead of me would still belong to me, exactly the way my husband and I had always intended.